Good evening, Ishmael. Bert, hello. Good evening. Welcome, everyone. Hello, hello. I'm so glad to see everyone this evening. Thank you for the rose. I appreciate it. This filter is crazy. Let me know, guys, if you can hear me all right. I have no idea if this filter messes up my sound at all. I don't think it should. Welcome, everyone. As you can see, we're doing something a bit spookily different this evening for our book reading. For those of you who may be new, welcome. Once a week, we typically do a book reading of a series, but in honor of Halloween coming up tomorrow, I've decided to take a little teeny tiny break from that and read from my Ghost Bible. I love this book. It is a compilation of some famous ghost stories and some not very well-known ghost stories, but there's usually a little something for everyone here in this book. So, if you would like to hang out with me and let me read to you for about an hour, I would be greatly appreciative. Drop a like, some comments as well if you like the stories, because this is our first official Halloween edition. Well, if you're joining me tonight, we're pre-gaming, so you'll see this tomorrow on my YouTube channel for Halloween proper. So for those of us that are here early, welcome. I'm glad you could join us. So, where did I get this book? Borders? Books A Million? I can't remember exactly where I found this book, but I mean, as you can tell, she's thick. She's got a lot of stories in here. So some of these will be short reads, some of them will be poems, and others will be actual stories that I myself have highlighted because I love them in particular. So we typically wait till about 5 after for people to join and get comfy and get a drink, as I have here, my pirate mug. Oh, not that this is a promotion, but in case you saw, this is a horn mug from a company called Alehorn, and they make really good products. Again, I'm not advertising. This is just a product review. I got one for my husband, a personalized one for my husband, and he loves it. We take it to Ren Fair with us. They're such fun to drink out of. Safe, clean, great guarantees, quality made. Highly recommend. All right. So for those of you who don't know, who's fighting what? Miss Deborah. What is this? Are you all right, Miss Deborah? Happy Monday, by the way. If you need to take some rest, my darling. Oh, you have COVID. No. I'm so sorry. Well, yes, then by all means, get some rest, stay hydrated. Ugh, just take it easy, okay? Too many people still downplay COVID, but it can still kick your butt, trust me. I've seen it enough times in enough of my clients. But anyway, it's about 8:05, so we shall get started. Let me see here. Which shall we read from first. How about a quartet of strange things? A Quartet of Strange Things by Bernard J. Herwood. Number 1. The Corpse at the Inn. From the Lao Chai of Pusangling. In a remote village located in the Yangshin district, there was once an old man who, with the aid of his son, kept a roadside inn. One evening, as the gathering shadows grew long and black, 4 weary travelers arrived and asked the landlord for a night's lodging. To their dismay, the old man refused their request, explaining that all the rooms were filled. But as it had become quite dark while they talked, and there was nowhere else for them to go, the men implored the innkeeper to make room for them wherever he could. Seeing that the 4 were genuinely distressed, the old man offered to put them up in a small outbuilding situated near the women's quarters. The strangers were greatly relieved and followed their host, who led the way carrying a small oil lamp in one hand. Now it happened that the innkeeper's daughter-in-law had died that day, and her corpse was laid out in the very room to which he led his unsuspecting guests. She was dressed in ceremonial paper robes, and lying on a makeshift wooden bier in deep shadow at the far end of the chamber. Near the door were 4 simple cots, and a plain wooden— I hope you all cannot hear the rumbling of my neighbor's motorcycle. I apologize. She was dressed in ceremonial paper robes, and lying on a makeshift wooden bier in deep shadow at the far end of the chamber. Near the door were 4 simple cots and a plain wooden table upon which he placed the flickering, smoky oil lamp. Then, taking his leave, he withdrew as quickly as he could, without arousing suspicion, and returned to the inn. The 4 lodgers were so exhausted that they did not notice the corpse with which they were forced to share quarters. Flinging themselves upon their couches, 3 of the men soon were sound asleep. The 4th, however, felt a strange premonition and lay staring at the eerie shadows cast by the sputtering lamp. He had finally begun to doze off when suddenly he heard a creaking noise accompanied by the rustling of paper. Daring not to move anything but his eyes, he glanced sideways in the direction of the ominous sounds. By now he had become accustomed to the murky darkness and saw at once what was happening. Fingers of ice seemed to grip his heart as he realized there was a corpse in the room. Worse yet, the dead body of the girl was rising stiffly from the bier, the dim light revealing the ghastly pallor of her lifeless face. Paralyzed with terror, the poor man beheld the animated corpse standing upright. In the next moment, the dreadful creature began gliding unmistakably toward the 3 who slept. As she reached the first man, she bent silently over him and exhaled in his face. She rose up and repeated her action over the 2nd and the 3rd sleepers. The 4th man, by now half dead with fright, pulled the cover over his face, held his breath, and listened for what seemed a veritable eternity. A chill came over him as she approached his bed and bent down as she had over the others. But then, hearing her footsteps recede, he stealthily peeked out from beneath his coverlet and saw her ascend the bier and stretch out, corpse-like as before. For a few moments the man lay still. Then, ever so cautiously, he stretched out one foot and kicked the nearest of his companions. But he shuddered, for it was like touching a dead man. By now, the unhappy fellow had no thought but of flight. Moving as softly as he could, he reached for his clothing so that he could make a dash for the door. But no sooner had he reached under the bed than once more he heard that awful creaking and rustling. Instinctively he buried his head beneath the cover again and held his breath as he had done before. After what seemed to be an eternity, the corpse came to him a second time and bent down to breathe its foul breath upon his face. Finally it retreated to the far end of the chamber to resume its place upon the bier. Now, wasting not an instant, the traveler seized his clothes and dashed to the door as fast as he could, but he was not alone. The dead girl, too, leaped to her feet and followed him into the night. Outdoors, the man plunged wildly into the darkness, shrieking at the top of his lungs. But there was no one to hear him but his ghastly pursuer, who was close upon his heels. Raising his voice as he passed the inn door was to no avail. His screams went unheeded, so he kept running toward the main road which led to the city. With the corpse keeping up its pace, the fleeing man looked about desperately for a place to hide. Suddenly, he noticed a small roadside monastery, and rushing up to the gate, he pounded with all his might. But alas, the priests inside knew not what to make of this unexpected tumult, and would not open the door. By now, the corpse was only yards away. In desperation, the man ran towards a huge willow tree that stood nearby, and just in time, for the dead girl reached the tree at the precise moment her quarry managed to dodge to one side. It now became a deadly game. The corpse, her eyes glowing fiercely like live coals, tried to seize her victim with demonic ferocity. But each time she moved to the left, he would rush to the right, and so it went until both were panting hoarsely at the brink of exhaustion. Then both the corpse and her intended victim stood motionless, staring at each other, he in mortal terror, she with the cold rage of an unnatural monster. Suddenly, the corpse lunged forward with outstretched arms to seize its victim once and for all. The man, believing that his end had finally come, fell backward, senseless to the ground. The corpse crashed into the tree with the force of a charging tiger. By now, the priests, who had been hearing the shrieks and moans, rushed out to find the cause of the disturbance. They found the unconscious stranger lying on the ground beside the tree, so they carried him into the monastery. By daybreak, they succeeded in bringing him to his senses, at which time he told them in detail of his horrible ordeal in the dark. When the sun was shining brightly, they went out to investigate the tree, and there found the corpse of the girl, hanging limply to the trunk. The local magistrate was summoned at once, and upon arriving he ordered that the body be removed. But this was impossible at first, for her long fingernails were embedded too deeply in the tree. Finally, she was detached, and word of the night's dreadful events were sent to the inn, where by now the 3 other travelers had been found dead. The innkeeper had the body of his daughter-in-law brought back, and the traveler who had lived requested that he be given a certificate attesting to the truth of his tale. The magistrate complied with the man's wishes, and he was accordingly sent home. Poor thing, probably had nightmares for years. Part 2. The Vampire of Croglan Grange. A number of years ago, 2 brothers and a sister rented a very old house in England called Croglan Grange. The place had no upper floor, so that all the bedrooms were at ground level. They were very fond of it, and especially enjoyed the surroundings, which were peaceful and extremely charming. A belt of graceful trees separated the property from an old churchyard, and on moonlit nights the entire area presented a view of unsurpassed beauty. One summer night, shortly after she had gone to bed, the sister, whose name was Flora, noticed that what appeared to be 2 lights flickering in and out of the trees bordering the churchyard. Watching with mild curiosity, she gradually became aware of something dark coming towards her window. A chill of uncontrollable horror overcame her as the shapeless dark mass came closer. She wanted to get up and run from the room, but by now she was so terrified that she became paralyzed with fear. Suddenly, the hideous thing appeared at the window. Never in her life had she seen anything so ugly, so ghastly. The face was brown and shriveled like that of a mummy, but it had fierce, blazing eyes that glared like coals from hell itself. As she cowered in her bed, the thing began scratching at the window. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Thank God the window was locked, she thought, but then, to her horror, she realized that it was picking at the leading of the mullioned window. The crash of the glass falling to the floor seemed to break the spell, and she leaped from the bed and ran to the door, just as a withered brown hand reached in and turned the lock. She was so busy fumbling with the doorknob that she wasn't aware of the speed with which the monstrous horror scuttled across the room and threw itself at her. Seizing her long hair with its bony fingers, it dragged her back to the bed, forced her down, bent over, and bit her ferociously in the throat. At that instant her voice came back, and she screamed with every ounce of strength that she had, while punching and kicking her hideous assailant with all her might. Seconds later, her brothers rushed into her room, and as one of them ran for a poker, the other gave chase to the creature as it ran like the wind across the lawn, over the low stone wall and into the churchyard. As terrible as her experience was, she refused to believe that it was anything supernatural, insisting that it had to be an attack by an escaped mental patient or a prisoner. But there was no news of any such thing, and besides, how could she explain the hideous appearance of the thing? After a brief stay in hospital whilst her wound healed, and a short stay abroad, she finally returned to Croglan Grange, assuring her brothers that the chances of any such thing happening again were virtually nil. Nevertheless, thereafter they kept loaded pistols in their rooms and tried to make her do the same, but she refused on grounds that she could not stand guns. After an uneventful winter, the woman was awakened from a sound sleep late one March night by the familiar sound of scratching at the window. Seizing the torch she kept by her bed, she switched it on and illuminated the window. There, fully bathed by the beam of light, was the same ghastly, brown, shriveled face with the glaring eyes and the bony hands. A single blood-curdling scream brought her brothers on the double, both with pistols in hand. The thing backed off and began retreating across the lawn with the two men hard on its heels. One fired a shot and hit it in the leg, but it kept running, and after scrambling back over the churchyard wall, disappeared into a vault showing signs of decay and neglect. The next day, the brothers gathered a number of their neighbors together, and after revealing what had happened the night before, led them to the vault and opened it. The sight that met their eyes was shocking, and unlike anything they had ever seen, except for one. All the coffins were broken open, and the bones of their occupants scattered on the floor. Upon opening the lid of the single coffin that was intact, they found the brown, shriveled, hideous creature that had broken into Croglan Grange. In one leg was a fresh bullet hole. After overcoming their initial shock, they removed the dreadful body, drenched it with petrol, and burned it to cinders. Although they never knew its origin, they were never bothered by the vampire again. Part 3. The Old Man in Yellow. There is hardly anything more unnerving than being followed by a hideous stranger on a lonely road at night, when the stranger proves to be non-human, but that is getting ahead of the story. It happened a few years ago to a young man named Elwyn Thomas, who happened to be visiting friends in a small village in South Wales. It was a warm June night, and darkness was just beginning to fall when he left his friends to return to the country inn where he was staying. Judging by past experience, he reckoned on reaching it by about 9 o'clock. It was exactly 8:30 when he said good night. He was completely alone in the gathering dusk, and the only sounds were the occasional cries of night birds and the crunch of his own footsteps on the gravel road. Being neither superstitious nor afraid of anything, he walked briskly along, glancing now and then toward the banks of an old canal off to one side of the road. After about 10 minutes, he began experiencing a peculiar, creepy sensation, as if he were being watched. On an impulse, he stopped, turned around, and gasped involuntarily. There, no more than a yard behind him, suspended in midair at eye level, was the most hideous face he had ever seen. The putty-colored skin was drawn tightly over the features, except for the forehead, which was lined with deep wrinkles. Thin, seemingly bloodless lips formed a crooked grin over a half-open, toothless mouth. The cheeks were hollow and corpse-like, and the eyes were wild, luminous, and piercing. Wrapped around the ghastly object were 2 pieces of old yellow calico, one under the jaw and tied on top of the head, the other over the forehead and tied behind. Unable to help himself, Thomas turned and began running as fast as he could. After having covered about 100 yards, he stopped to catch his breath and turned around again. To his horror, the face was still there, as if he hadn't moved an inch. On an impulse, he dropped down, grabbed a handful of gravel, and hurled it at the face, then turned and ran again. When he finally reached the inn, he stopped at the path leading off the road and looked back again. The head was still behind him. Cautiously, he backed up in the direction of the inn and was surprised to observe that this time the head remained above the road, grinning somewhat contemptuously. Taking courage, he decided to go back, confront the apparition, and question it. But as he approached, the head began receding, its glowing eyes fixed almost malevolently on his own. Now he felt as though he had to follow. Down the road he went slowly, like a sleepwalker, until the head disappeared over a stone wall surrounding a little graveyard not far from the inn. Suddenly he felt everything begin to spin. Then he lost consciousness. When he came to again, it was late at night. He had lain at the foot of the churchyard wall for more than 2 hours. Groping through the darkness until he found his way back to the inn, it was with great relief that he finally retired to bed into a restless night filled with bad dreams. When he told the innkeeper about his experience the next day, he learned that he had not been having hallucinations. An eccentric old recluse, fitting the exact description of the apparition, had once lived in a cottage whose ruins were quite near to the place where the face had disappeared. No one could remember exactly how long the old man had been dead, but they knew it had been many years since he had been last seen alive. Part 4. The Glowing Maggot of Doom. Okay, all right. Perhaps the most loathsome and terrifying apparition ever seen was a maggoty creature that was said to have haunted a little Yorkshire churchyard years ago. The first man to see it was Mr. Mullins, the postman. It was a bright, moonlit night, and he was passing the graveyard on his way home. What caught his attention was a large blob of luminous ooze issuing from the fresh grave of a recently dead villager named Peters. Wriggling like a giant, ugly glowworm, it grew bigger as it issued from the ground. Horrified, yet fascinated, Mullins followed the thing, which now looked exactly like a giant maggot. But he had to summon all his courage, for when he saw its eyes, he was forced to avert his own. They seemed to exude pure evil, and somehow appeared strangely human. The ghastly monster slithered along the ground with a caterpillar's wriggle, leaving a gleaming trail of disgusting slime in its wake. To Mullins's amazement, the maggot wriggled in and out between the tombstones, left the graveyard, and disappeared from sight when it reached the threshold of the vicar's house nearby. The following day, Mullins told his wife and his best friend about his chilling experience, and that night the three of them went to the churchyard to see if they could discover what the hideous apparition might be. Just as it had the night before, the dreadful worm oozed from Peters's grave, made its way to the vicar's house, and again disappeared at the threshold. The next day, however, the Mullinses and their friend received a severe shock. The vicar and his entire family had suddenly been taken ill, and were dead by sunset. The doctor who examined them attributed their deaths to ptomaine poisoning. More determined than ever to get to the bottom of this horrible apparition's origin, Mullins, his wife, and their friend ventured once again to the village churchyard after dark that night. Again the hideous glowing maggot wriggled out of the grave and slithered between the tombstones, leaving the now familiar trail of slime in its path. This time they followed it to the house of the village blacksmith, into which it vanished. There was no need for it to visit him a second time, for he became ill in the morning and died before sunset, like the vicar and his family, of ptomaine poisoning. Thoroughly alarmed, but more baffled than ever, Mullins and his companions determined to keep watch again that same night. Nothing happened. Somewhat relieved, they nevertheless decided to continue their nightly vigil at the graveyard for at least 1 more week. 10 nights after it had first appeared, it emerged from its customary place again, only to head directly to the Mullinses' house. They were horror-stricken but powerless. That night they spent in sleepless, terrified anticipation. In the morning, tragedy struck, and their 5-year-old son died an hour after being taken ill. That night, their hearts filled with grief and hatred, Mullins and his wife, aided by their friend, went back to the village churchyard. This time, they had a plan. Equipped with a wooden lantern and spades, they dug up the grave of the late Mr. Peters. When they finally struck the coffin, Mullins and his friend pried off the lid while Mrs. Mullins held the lantern. There, on the dead man's face, was an expression of such unspeakable malevolence that they slammed the lid down and staggered back involuntarily. But after composing themselves, they put a rope around the corpse and dragged it from the grave. After resting for a few moments, they took the body to a deserted field nearby, saturated it with kerosene, and burnt it to cinders. Then, returning to the cemetery, they filled in the grave and covered up all traces of their deed. For several nights after this they went back, but the monstrous maggot of death was never seen again. Mullins later learned that the dead man had been on bad terms with both the vicar and the blacksmith, but he himself had never had any trouble with Peters. For what reason, then, did the glowing harbinger of evil visit his house? He never learned, but he thanked Providence that he never saw it again. All right. Quick water break. Oh, goodness. Oh, please don't fall. Okay. Did you guys like those stories? That's just the start. Let's see. What shall we read next? Let's see. Ooh. Who Rides with Santa Anna? Let's see. 133. Okay. Oh no, just kidding. Let us first read The Ghost of the Capuchins by Eugene Montfort, adapted from the French by Faith Lancereau and Marvin Kay. I'm hoping I read those names correctly. I don't speak French, so, I tried. Toward the end of the last century, I settled for the winter in Palermo, the magnificent city whose rough, majestic architecture is softened by breezes from the Tyrrhenian Sea. My apartment was in an area called Quattro Canti, a place in the very center of town where the houses are richly ornamented and offset by statuary of antique nobility. Four Corners, for that is the meaning of the street's name, is busy morning and night with streams of natives whose features blend the hauteur of the proud Castilian and the more voluptuous characteristics of the Arab. I stayed at the home of a Spanish gentleman named Herrera, whose ancestors came from Sicily. There, amid the sculptured marble palaces of the Via Maqueda, I dwelled, in a second-floor apartment with windows commanding all the comings and goings of Quattro Canti. Herrera, my host, was discreet. Though my rooms were part of his home, he never showed himself to me unless I wished him to. Other than the day he took me up to his apartment, I don't suppose I spoke with him for more than twice in as many weeks. That first day he unlocked the door, swung it wide, and allowed me to discover for myself the merits or shortcomings of the place. No word passed his lips as I investigated the simple quarters. A heavy oak table with sculptured feet distinguished one corner, and a gilded wooden Madonna rested on the bureau. An old painting of a young dark girl in religious habit completed the decor. Otherwise, the place was unremarkable, but tidy and immaculately clean. "Who is she?" I asked, indicating the portrait of the pretty girl. She had large, dark, bewildered eyes, and when I stepped closer and examined the canvas and the frame, I guessed it must have been painted at least as far back as the time of Louis XIV. The painting was at the foot of the bed, next to an armchair, which I decided would be a fine place to sit and read in. "Who is she?" I asked once more. Herrera shrugged. "I know no more than you." I agreed to take the rooms and settled in that very afternoon. Days passed, and I led a quiet existence in Palermo. My afternoons and evenings were spent in strolls of charming gardens, walks to the market or to the port, and many visits to the Palatine Chapel, so renowned for its beauty. I made few friends, but those I met would usually be at the shipping mall at close of day, and there I would join them. Thus I became thoroughly familiar with all the sights of that remarkable city. all except one. On the outskirts of Palermo is a Capuchin monastery and burial catacombs famous throughout the town for vaults filled with the skeletons of long times past. Everyone I spoke with recommended the place to me, and my friends asserted more than once that I must not leave Palermo before viewing the great Capuchin city of death. Yet I stayed away from it for a long time. I do not care for things of the macabre cast. The opportunities of the grave fill me with loathing and shatter my sleep. But every week that elapsed made it harder for me to admit to my friends that, as yet, I had not gone to the monastery. I avoided the subject as much as possible, but there came a time when the very word monk ensured an unquiet evening abed, and at length I felt compelled to get it over with, so obsessive had the subject become. What matter, I thought, whether I subsequently woke up in a sweat? The mere thought of the place had already rendered some of my nights unbearable. One morning, when the weather was mild and I felt more rested and calm than circumstances lately had permitted, I set off for the monastery. As I neared the boundary of the outer white wall that shut off the Capuchins from the rest of the world, I thought I could detect on the faces of the people of the neighborhood a sort of sardonic satisfaction, as if to say, "Another going in, but he'll look different when he comes out." By the time I was at the entryway, I felt like turning around and quietly returning to Senor Herrera's. But the distance was far, and I knew if I did not go in today, it would be harder to avoid tomorrow, so I passed the archway and spoke to the clerk. He exchanged a few polite words, then, without further converse or preparation, opened the gate and ushered me downstairs to the burial vaults. I was completely taken aback by the vastness of the dreadful vista. A long hallway stacked from floor to ceiling with bodies. Skeletons covered in black, gloved hands crossed at the waist, gaping sockets that once contained flesh stared sightlessly downward. At their feet, rows of glassed-in coffins held more recent human remains, while high up near the ceiling a long ledge held still more skinless piles of bones. Everywhere, clothed skeletons leaned forward, discussing me, as it were, with silent laughter, but their joke was plain enough, though never uttered. The monk escorted me through great galleries of the dead. Though I soon felt faint, he merely appeared bored. When I stopped, he stopped. When I stumbled forward, he resumed his place. The place stretched out so far that I thought there must be no end. After a while, once the first shock grew duller, the hideous spectacle began to assume a ghoulish attraction of its own. I was simultaneously repulsed and fascinated by the rotted faces. The mystery of death possessed me. I sought its secrets in the downcast heads that studied the floor in a stupor, grinning with broken teeth and jaws. Here a large skeleton rested by a smaller one, the pair posing for some morbid genius of the canvas. Over there, shreds of gray hair and bits of skin still clung to a smooth white skull, its shriveled expression atrocious, as if shrieking out the unfairness of the state of death. Yet its nearest neighbor smiled gently, sadly, while high above its head an elder statesman reflected deeply, perhaps, on how best to legislate the improved condition of the charnel house. 2 bodies away, mere surprise contorted moldering facial bones. One skeleton stood apart from the others. Instead of leaning toward the ground, its skull pointed forward, as if it had raised its head expressly to catch my eye. Its left shoulder brushed familiarly against a smaller, adjacent body. I moved closer and read the name of the ghoul, whose empty sockets seemed to fix me in their hypnotic command. Pietro Catala, April 8th, 1684. So old, then. I could not bear more. I signaled to my guide that I was anxious to return to the world of the living. But the blue sky brought little relief as I returned to my apartment. Looking out the window, I saw the smiles of the passers-by and knew they were, without realizing it, rehearsing for the final death grin they would share with the skeletons of the vault, the grim, wordless jest that ridiculed all projects and prospects we yearn for in life. That night, I asked my landlord if he had any books on Palermo that I might borrow. He rooted about in his library, gathered up several, and passed them to me. I took them to my sitting room, but did not browse in them until the following morning, when, rested by a sound sleep and in good spirits, I began to pick through the pile. A ray of sunshine lit the apartment. I could hear joyful noises in the street, and turning my thoughts away from the Capuchin monks and their grisly charges, I anticipated strolling through the city and taking in the air by Portside, perhaps lunching on shellfish. But as I was about to set aside Herrera's books and quit the room, a parchment-bound old tome at the bottom of the pile arrested my attention. I picked it up, somehow compelled to examine it. Yellowed by time, it bore on the cover the following lengthy title: Collection of Rare Facts and Strange Happenings in Palermo from 1650 to 1700 A.D. I sat down in my chair beneath the old picture and returned to the first few entries, but in truth, they were not especially interesting. I closed the book, turned it on its side to study the spine, but my fingers slipped and it fell to the floor. As it did, its leaves opened of their own accord to a place far back in the volume. My eye scanned it for an instant, then, discovering the import, I picked up the tome and read the prudential passage word for word. 1684. On April 8, there occurred a dreadful thing, an event that was the subject of a conversation for a long time thereafter. A young man of 23 years, one Pietro Catala, eldest son of a renowned inhabitant of the city, became engaged to Bianca Bellafiore, also of an old and illustrious clan. They were to be plighted to one another according to the family's intentions 1 month hence, but God's ways cannot be perceived by sinning mortals. At 4 in the afternoon on the 8th day of April, as the couple strolled along the Montreal road admiring the beauty of the spring season, a violent storm erupted. The lovers took refuge beneath a tree, but Providence hurled down a great lightning bolt, and Pietro was struck. He died instantly, and Bianca, overcome by grief, fainted. The beautiful, sad young girl never married another, but joined a nearby convent, taking the veil on the very day she would have wed Pietro. How sad. As I read, I thought I saw once more in the Capuchin skeleton whose head was erect, whose name was attached to the clothing, Pietro Catala. The air in my room, so fresh a moment earlier, now seemed to choke me. I leaped up, grabbed my hat, and left the room, slamming the door, ran downstairs and into the street. Solitude suddenly unsettled me. I had to be surrounded by the crowd walking along the Quattro Canti. It was no accident, something whispered to me, that I had especially noted the remains of the lad whom lightning struck so long ago. The coincidence held some dreadful significance, I was afraid, though what it might be, I was powerless to discern. I found my friends at the cafe and eagerly told them the occurrences of the past day and morning, but they totally missed the point, treated the affair lightly. They had neither solace nor wisdom to shed or share, and I quickly quitted the place. Their gaiety, their idle talk was superficial, vain. It no longer appealed to me. Behind their vacuous laughter I heard a darker humor. It was twilight, nearly dark. To get to the center of the city, I took a small deserted road and walked along it distractedly, sorry I'd chosen such a lifeless thoroughfare. In front of me, someone walked slowly, quietly. The absence of any footfall began to worry at my nerves, and when I thought to pass him by, the most mundane of details caught my eye, and I shuddered. His clothing was too large. It looked like the black dress of a Capuchin. I tried to convince myself it was a mistake, that my overexcited brain saw resemblances that were not there. Again, I considered walking faster to overtake the creature and look at his face, but I did not. Instead, I stopped in the middle of the roadway, stock still. What if I saw nothing there but bone, hollow cavities where eyes once were? I waited till the silent pedestrian was far ahead of me, still treading along the road in silence. Then I ducked down a side path and found another route to the well-lit and busy Maqueda road. I could not return yet to the empty rooms of the Quattro Canti. Instead, I sought the calculated repartee of the theatre, purchasing a seat where a popular comedy was playing. But I found nothing within to smile about. On the contrary, the so-called playwright's wit seemed stupid and forced, and withal so irritating that I left before the final act. At last, late in the evening, I returned home. I sensed nothing peculiar upon entering my room. The window was wide open, and the usual street sounds wafted up to my ears. It was impossible to sleep when the windows remained open, so I closed the shutters, curtains, and blinds in order to muffle the outside noise. I undressed by candlelight, and as I did, noted how my room appeared enormous. I had never before heeded how the taper flickered and dimmed and created so many shadowy corners. An urge arose in me to check every cranny, to peer in each nook, even to look under my bed. For a long time I refrained, thinking how ridiculous I was being, but in the end I could not help but make a detailed inspection of every corner, the narrowest recesses, places not even large enough for small animals to hide. At last I finally reassured myself that I was the only person there. I double-checked the lock, then fell into the armchair, wondering why my minute scrutiny failed to calm me down, but rather increased my agitation. I'd felt ill at ease that morning, but now the sensation was infinitely worse, hardly tolerable. An unknown, invisible presence seemed to stifle the entire room, and even the eyes of the portrait flickered in the candle flame as if lit with awareness that I was also there. Next to the door stood a great mirror. I tried to avert my gaze from it, lest it reflect something more than the room appeared to hold. Yet time and time again it pulled me back, though I dared not to look, even as I dared not to avoid it. The air was too warm, yet too cold. I sweated and shivered with sudden chill. Something ominous seemed to impend. My heart pounded, my breath rasped unevenly in my chest. I thought I might be growing delirious. At last, hoping that sleep might banish all terror, I lay down on my bed, hastily throwing the bedclothes aside. I stretched out and breathed deeply, willing myself to become calm. It did not help. I began to toss and turn, but could not sleep. I blamed my insomnia on the unsnuffed candle. I usually slumber in darkness, but that night the idea of no light in the room was too hideous to bear, so I finally pulled the sheet over my face to keep the light out of my eyes. Rest came after a long, long time. In the middle of the night I awoke, suddenly more nervous than I'd ever been. The sheet was still over my head. I saw nothing other than the muted glow of the candle through the cloth. But I heard a strange sound, a kind of rubbing on the floor as if something was being dragged about the room. Not walking, more of a sliding, scuffing noise. I didn't dare remove the sheet. I listened, teeth on edge, tight to keep them from chattering. The sliding was too deliberate and too heavy to be a small animal that might have gnawed through the woodwork into the chamber. Yet no human would walk like that. The scraping sound was dreadful to hear. And then the noise stopped, and a silence even more terrible ensued. It was undoubtedly very late. Nothing could be heard from the street below, and now nothing disturbed the absolute stillness of my room. I was in a cold sweat, dared not move, but with every second that I heard nothing, I grew more frightened, afraid of what might be hovering just above me in the gloom. My ignorance was an added torment, and at length I resolved I must see what was going on, no matter what it might cost me. I lifted the sheet and gazed anxiously around the room. There by the armchair where earlier I sat knelt a black-robed figure, its back to me, its body entirely covered in the enveloping rough garb of the Capuchins. As I gazed in horror and dread, the thing raised its arms in supplication to the old portrait of the woman. As it did, the sleeves fell back to its shoulders, and where arms should have been, I saw nothing but the outstretched bones and splayed fingers of a skeleton. The picture itself was ringed with pale fire, and the eyes of the long-dead woman depicted in its frame seemed to turn downward to regard the foul creature below with a mixture of pity and fondness. When I awoke, it was daylight. The room was empty, though still dark. I leapt from bed and pushed back the shutters, letting in the blessed light of morning. The door was locked from inside, just as I'd left it. I crossed over to the picture, telling myself such coincidences cannot occur. Pictures like this are sold in every gallery or antique shop. The features were not in the least unusual, and the eyes certainly were not cast downward, nor did they seem to smile. But when I wiped the frame clean with a damp towel, I saw centered in the middle of its bottom edge the name, Bianca Belliforre. I returned to the Capuchin catacombs that day. The monk who admitted me looked surprised. Visitors rarely return for a second tour. He followed me as I strode along the avenues of death, this time neither looking right nor left, till I came at last to the remains of Pietro Catala. I asked the monk whether he ever moved any of the skeletons. He shook his head, puzzled, and assured me he never touched them. Yet the head of Catala now faced the ground. The eyes did not seek mine, nor did he lean any longer against the neighboring skeleton. I gave the monk a coin and fled. I left Palermo that morning, telling Signor Herrera that I had received a telegram calling me away immediately. He looked skeptical, knowing very well my mail passed through his hands first. I did not wish to go to my room, so I asked him to pack my trunk and send all to the address I supplied. Just before I left, I asked him whether he ever heard anything peculiar at night, but he shook his head. It is curious, though, he told me, looking as if he wanted me to say more, but knowing no gentleman pried into another's affairs. Your room has an excellent view, and I have priced it reasonably enough. Yet I never seem to keep tenants in it for very long. All right. What time is it? 8:45. Let me see. I think we have time for one more. Needs to be a good one. Let me see here. Yes. One of my favorite ones. How Fear Departed from the Long Gallery. Yes, yes, yes. I love this one. How Fear Departed from the Long Gallery by E.F. Benson. Church Peveril is a house so beset and frequented by spectres both visible and audible that none of the family which it shelters under its acre and a half of green copper roofs takes psychical phenomena with any seriousness. So, for to the Peverils the appearance of a ghost is a matter of hardly greater significance than the appearance of the post to those who live in more ordinary houses. It arrives, that is to say, practically every day. It knocks, or makes other noises. It is observed coming up the drive, or in other places. I myself, when staying there, have seen the present Mrs. Peveril, who is rather short-sighted, peer into the dusk, while we were taking our coffee on the terrace after dinner, and say to her daughter, "My dear, was that not the blue lady who has just gone into the shrubbery? I hope she won't frighten Flo. Whistle for Flo, dear." Flo, it may be remarked, is the youngest and most precious of many dachshunds. Blanche Peveril gave a cursory whistle and crunched the sugar left unmelted at the bottom of her coffee cup between her very white teeth. "Oh, darling, Flo isn't so silly as to mind," she said. "Poor blue Aunt Barbara is such a bore. Whenever I meet her, she always looks as if she wants to speak to me, but when I say, 'What is it, Aunt Barbara?' she never speaks, but only points somewhere toward the house, which is so vague. I believe there was something she wanted to confess about 200 years ago, but she has forgotten what it is." Here Flo gave two or three short, pleased barks, and came out of the shrubbery wagging her tail, and capering round what appeared to me to be a perfectly empty space on the lawn. "There! Flo has made friends with her," said Mrs. Peveril. "I wonder why she dresses in that very stupid shade of blue." From this it may be gathered that even with regard to psychic phenomena there is some truth in the proverb that speaks of familiarity. But the Peverils do not exactly treat their ghosts with contempt, since most of that delightful family never despised anybody except such people as avowedly did not care for hunting or shooting or golf or skating. and as all of their ghosts are of their family, it seems reasonable to suppose that they all, even the poor blue lady, excelled at one time in field sports. So far, then, they harbor no such unkindness or contempt, but only pity. Of one Peveril, indeed, who broke his neck in vainly attempting to ride up the main staircase on a thoroughbred mare after some monstrous and violent deed in the back garden, they are very fond, and Blanche comes downstairs in the morning with an eye unusually bright when she can announce that Master Anthony was very loud last night. He, apart from the fact that his having been so foul a ruffian, was a tremendous fellow across country, that they like these indications of the continuance of his superb vitality. In fact, it is supposed to be a compliment, when you go to stay at Church Peveril, to be assigned a bedroom which is frequented by defunct members of the family. It means that you are worthy to look on the august and villainous dead, and you will find yourself shown into some vaulted or tapestried chamber, without benefit of electric light, and are told that great-great-grandmamma Bridget occasionally has vague business by the fireplace, but it is better not to talk to her, and that you will hear Master Anthony awfully well if he attempts the front staircase any time before morning. There you are left for your night's repose, and having quakingly undressed, begin reluctantly to put out your candles. It is draughty in these great chambers, and the solemn tapestry swings and bellows and subsides, and the firelight dances on the forms of huntsmen and warriors and stern pursuits. Then you climb into your bed, a bed so huge that you feel as if the desert of Sahara was spread before you, and pray, like the mariners who sailed with St. Paul, for day. And all the time you are aware that Freddie and Harry and Blanche and possibly even Mrs. Peveril are quite capable of dressing up and making disquieting tappings outside your door, so that when you open it some inconjecturable horror fronts you. For myself, I stick steadily to the assertion that I have an obscure valvular disease of the heart, and so sleep undisturbed in the new wing of the house, where Aunt Barbara and great-great-grandmamma Bridget and Master Anthony never penetrate. I forget the details of great-great-grandmamma Bridget, but she certainly cut the throat of some distant relation before she disemboweled herself with the axe that had been used at Agincourt. Before that she had led a very sultry life, crammed with amazing incidents. But there was one ghost at Church Peveril at which the family never laugh, in which they feel no friendly and amused interest, and of which they only speak just as much as is necessary for the safety of their guests. More properly, it should be described as two ghosts, for the haunt in question is that of two very young children, who were twins. These, not without reason, the family take very seriously indeed. The story of them, as told to me by Mrs. Peveril, is as follows. In the year 1602, the same being the last of Queen Elizabeth's reign, a certain Dick Peveril was greatly in favour at court. He was brother to Master Joseph Peveril, then owner of the family house and lands, who 2 years previously, at the respectable age of 74, became father of twin boys, firstborn of his progeny. It is known that the royal and ancient virgin had said to handsome Dick, who was nearly 40 years his brother's junior, "'Tis pity you were not master of Church Peveril," and these words probably suggested to him a sinister design. Be that as it may, handsome Dick, who very adequately sustained the family reputation for wickedness, set off to ride down to Yorkshire, and found that, very conveniently, his brother Joseph had just been seized with an apoplexy, which appeared to be the result of a continued spell of hot weather combined with the necessity of quenching his thirst with an augmented amount of sack. Sack being wine. Just so we're all on the same page here. And had actually died while handsome Dick, with God knows what thoughts in his mind, was journeying northwards. Thus it came about that he arrived at Church Peveril just in time for his brother's funeral. It was with great propriety that he attended the obsequies, and returned to spend a sympathetic day or two of mourning with his widowed sister-in-law, who was but a faint-hearted dame, little fit to be mated with such hawks as these. On the second night of his stay, he did that which the Peverils regret to this day. He entered the room where the twins slept with their nurse and quietly strangled the latter as she slept. Then he took the twins and put them into the fire which warms the long gallery. The weather, which up to the day of Joseph's death had been so hot, had changed suddenly to bitter cold. and the fire was heaped high with burning logs and was exultant with flame. In the core of this conflagration he struck out a cremation chamber, and into that he threw the two children, stamping them down with his riding boots. They could just walk, but they could not walk out of that ardent place. It is said that he laughed as he added more logs. Thus he became master of Church Peveril. The crime was never brought home to him, but he lived no longer than a year in the enjoyment of his blood-stained inheritance. When he lay a-dying, he made his confession to the priest who attended him, but his spirit struggled forth from its fleshy coil before absolution could be given him. On that very night there began in Church Peveril the haunting to which to this day is but seldom spoken of by the family, and then only in low tones with serious mien. For, only an hour or two after Handsome Dick's death, one of the servants passing the door of the long gallery heard from within peals of the loud laughter so jovial, and yet so sinister, which he had thought would never be heard in the house again. In a moment of that cold courage which is so nearly akin to mortal terror, he opened the door and entered, expecting to see he knew not what manifestation of him who lay dead in the room below. Instead, he saw two little white-robed figures toddling towards him hand in hand across the moonlit floor. The watchers in the room below ran upstairs, startled by the crash of his fallen body, and found him lying in the grip of some dread convulsion. Just before morning, he regained consciousness and told his tale. Then, pointing with trembling and ashy gray finger towards the door, he screamed aloud, and so fell back dead. During the next 50 years, this strange and terrible legend of the twin babies became fixed and consolidated. Their appearance, luckily for those who inhabited the house, was exceedingly rare, and during these years they seem to have been seen 4 or 5 times only. On each occasion they appeared at night, between sunset and sunrise, always in the same long gallery, and always as two toddling children scarcely able to walk. And on each occasion the luckless individual who saw them died either speedily or terribly, or with both speed and terror, after the accursed vision had appeared to him. Sometimes he might live for a few months. He was lucky if he died, as did the servant who first saw them, in a few hours. Vastly more awful was the fate of a certain Mrs. Canning, who had the ill luck to see them in the middle of the next century, or, to be quite accurate, in the year 1760. By this time, the hours and the place of their appearance were well known, and, as up till a year ago, visitors were warned not to go between sunset and sunrise into the long gallery. Duh. But Mrs. Canning, a brilliantly clever and beautiful woman, admirer also and friend of the notorious skeptic M. Voltaire, willfully went and sat night after night, in spite of all protestations, in the haunted place. For 4 evenings she saw nothing, but on the 5th she had her will, for the door in the middle of the gallery opened, and there came toddling towards her the ill-omened, innocent little pair. It seemed that even then she was not frightened, but she thought, good, poor wretch, to mock at them, tell him it was time for them to get back into the fire. They gave no word in answer, but turned away from her, crying and sobbing. Immediately after they disappeared from her vision, she rustled downstairs to where the family and guests in the house were waiting for her, with the triumphant announcement that she had seen them both, and must needs write to M. Voltaire, Monsieur Voltaire, oh my lord, saying that she had spoken to spirits made manifest. It would make him laugh, but when some months later the whole news reached him, he did not laugh at all. Mrs. Canning was one of the great beauties of her day, and in the year 1760 she was at the height and zenith of her blossoming. The chief beauty, if it is possible to single out one point where all was so exquisite, lay in the dazzling color and incomparable brilliance of her complexion. She was now just 30 years of age, but in spite of the excesses of her life, retained the snow and roses of girlhood, and she courted the bright light of day which other women shunned, for it but showed to greater advantage the splendor of her skin. In consequence, she was very considerably dismayed one morning, about a fortnight after her strange experience in the long gallery, to observe on her left cheek, an inch or two below her turquoise-colored eyes, a little grayish patch of skin, about as big as a 3-penny piece. It was in vain that she applied her accustomed washes and unguents. Vain, too, were the arts of her fardeuse and of her medical adviser. For a week she kept herself secluded, martyring herself with solitude and unaccustomed physics, and for the result at the end of the week she had no amelioration to comfort herself with. Instead, this woeful grey patch had doubled itself in size. Thereafter, the nameless disease, whatever it was, developed in new and terrible ways. From the center of the discolored place there sprouted 4 little lichen-like tendrils of greenish-gray, and another patch appeared on her lower lip. This, too, soon vegetated, and one morning, on opening her eyes to the horror of the new day, she found that her vision was strangely blurred. She sprang to her looking-glass, and what she saw caused her to shriek aloud with terror. From under her upper eyelid a fresh growth had sprung up, mushroom-like, in the night, and its filaments extended downwards, screening the pupil of her eye. Soon after, her tongue and throat were attacked, the air passages became obstructed, and death by suffocation was merciful after such suffering. More terrible yet was the case of a certain Colonel Blantyre, who fired at the children with his revolver. What he went through is not to be recorded here. It is this haunting, then, that the Peverills take quite seriously, and every guest on his arrival in the house is told that the long gallery must not be entered after nightfall on any pretext whatsoever. By day, however, it is a delightful room which intrinsically merits description, apart from the fact that the due understanding of its geography is necessary for the account that here follows. It is full 80 feet in length. It is lit by a row of 6 tall windows overlooking the gardens at the back of the house. A door communicates with the landing at the top of the main staircase, and about halfway down the gallery in the wall facing the windows is another door communicating with the back staircase and servants' quarters, and thus the gallery forms a constant place of passage for them in going to the rooms on the first landing. It was through this door that the baby figures came when they appeared to Mrs. Canning, and on several other occasions they have been known to make their entry here, for the room out of which Handsome Dick took them lies just beyond at the top of the back of the stairs. Further on again in the gallery is the fireplace, into which he thrust them, and at the far end a large window box looks straight down the avenue. Above this fireplace there hangs with grim significance a portrait of Handsome Dick, in the insolent beauty of early manhood, attributed to Holbein, and a dozen other portraits of great merit face the windows. During the day, this is the most frequented sitting-room in the house, for its other visitors never appear there then, nor does it then ever resound with the harsh, jovial laugh of Handsome Dick, which sometimes, after dark has fallen, is heard by passers-by on the landing outside. But Blanche does not grow bright-eyed when she hears it. She shuts her ears and hastens to put a greater distance between her and the sound of that atrocious laugh. But during the day the long gallery is frequented by many occupants, and much laughter in no wise sinister or saturnine resounds there. When summer lies hot over the land, those occupants lounge in the deep window seats, and when winter spreads his icy fingers and blows shrilly between his frozen palms, congregate around the fireplace at the far end, and perch, in companies of cheerful chatterers, upon sofa and chair back and floor. Often I have sat there on long August evenings up till dressing time, but never have I been there when anyone has seemed disposed to linger over late without hearing the warning, "It is close on sunset. Shall we go?" Later on, in the shorter autumn days, they often have tea laid there, and sometimes it has happened that, even while merriment was most uproarious, Mrs. Peveril was suddenly looked out of the window and said, "My dears, it is getting so late. Let us finish our nonsense downstairs in the hall." And then for a moment a curious hush always falls on the loquacious family and guests alike, and as if some bad news had just been known, we all make our silent way out of the place. But the spirits of the Peverils, of the living ones, that is to say, are the most mercurial imaginable, and the blight with which the thought of Handsome Dick and his doings cast over them passes away again with amazing rapidity. A typical party, large, young, and peculiarly cheerful, was staying at Church Peveril shortly after Christmas last year, and as usual, on December 31st, Mrs. Peveril was giving her annual New Year's Eve ball. The house was quite full, and she had commandeered as well the greater part of the Peveril Arms to provide sleeping quarters for the overflow from the house. For some days past, a black and windless frost had stopped all hunting. But it is an ill windlessness that blows no good, if so mixed a metaphor may be forgiven, and the lake below the house had for at least the last 2 days been covered with an adequate and admirable sheet of ice. Everyone in the house had been occupied all the morning of that day in performing swift and violent maneuvers on the elusive surface, and as soon as lunch was over we all, with one exception, hurried out again. This one exception was Madge Dalrymple, who had had the misfortune to fall rather badly earlier in the day, but hoped, by resting her injured knee, instead of joining the skaters again, to be able to dance that evening. The hope, it is true, was of the most sanguine sort, for she could but hobble ignobly back to the house, but with the breezy optimism which characterizes the Peverils. She is Blanche's first cousin. She remarked that it would be but tepid enjoyment that she could, in her present state, derive from further skating, and thus she sacrificed little, but might gain much. According, after a rapid cup of coffee which was served in the long gallery, we left Madge comfortably reclined on the big sofa, at right angles to the fireplace, with an attractive book to beguile the tedium till tea. Being of the family, she knew all about Handsome Dick and the babies, and the fate of Mrs. Canning, and Colonel Blantyre, but as we went out I heard Blanche say to her, "Don't run it too fine, dear," and Madge replied, "No, I'll go away well before sunset." And so we left her alone in the long gallery. Madge read her attractive book for some minutes, but failing to get absorbed in it, put it down and limped across to the window. Though it was still but a little after 2, it was but a dim and uncertain light that entered, for the crystalline brightness of the morning had given place to a veiled obscurity produced by flocks of thick clouds which were coming sluggishly up from the northeast. Already the whole sky was overcast with them, and occasionally a few snowflakes fluttered waveringly down past the long windows. From the darkness and bitter cold of that afternoon, it seemed to her that there was like to be a heavy snowfall before long, and these outward signs were echoed inwardly in her by all that muffled drowsiness of the brain, which to those who are sensitive to the pressures and lightness of weather portends storm. Madge was peculiarly the prey of such external influences. To her a brisk morning gave an ineffable brightness and briskness of spirit, and correspondingly the approach of heavy weather produced a solemnness in sensation that both drowsed and depressed her. It was in such mood that as she limped back again to the sofa beside the log fire. The whole house was comfortably heated by water pipes, and though the fire of logs and peat, an adorable mixture, had been allowed to burn low, the room was very warm. Idly she watched the dwindling flames, not opening her book again, but lying on the sofa with face toward the fireplace, intending drowsily and not immediately to go to her own room and spend the hours, until the return of the skaters made gaiety in the house again, in writing 1 or 2 neglected letters. Still drowsily, she began to thinking over what she had to communicate. One letter, several days overdue, should go to her mother, who was immensely interested in the psychical affairs of the family. She would tell how Master Anthony had been prodigiously active on the staircase a night or 2 ago, and how the Blue Lady, regardless of the severity of the weather, had been seen by Mrs. Peveril that morning, strolling about. It was rather interesting. The Blue Lady had gone down the Laurel Walk and had been seen by her to enter the stables, where, at the moment, Freddie Peveril was inspecting the frost-bound hunters. Identically, then, a sudden panic had spread through the stables, and the horses had whinnied and kicked and shied and sweated. Of the fatal twins nothing had been seen for many years past, but, as her mother knew, the Peverils never used the long gallery after dark. Then for a moment she sat up, remembering that she was in the long gallery now. But it was still but a little after 2:30. And if she went to her room in a half an hour, she would have ample time to write this and another letter before tea. Till then she would read her book. But she found that she had left it on the window-sill, and it seemed scarcely worth while to get it. She felt exceedingly drowsy. The sofa where she lay had been lately recovered, in a grayish-green shade of velvet, somewhat the color of lichen. It was of very thick, soft texture, and she luxuriously stretched her arms out, one on each side of her body, and pressed her fingers into the nap. How horrible that story of Mrs. Canning was! The growth on her face was of the color of lichen. And then, without further transition or blurring of thought, Madge fell asleep. She dreamed. She dreamed that she awoke and found herself exactly where she had gone to sleep, and in exactly the same attitude. The flames from the logs had burned up again and leaped onto the walls, fitfully illuminating the picture of Handsome Dick above the fireplace. In her dream, she knew exactly what she had done today, and for what reason she was lying there now instead of being out with the rest of the skaters. She remembered also, still dreaming, that she was going to write a letter or two before tea, and prepared to get up in order to go to her room. As she half rose, she caught sight of her own arms lying out on each side of her on the gray velvet sofa, but she could not see where her hands ended and where the gray velvet began. Her fingers seemed to have melted into the stuff. She could see her wrists quite clearly, and a blue vein on the backs of her hands, and here and there a knuckle. Then in her dream she remembered the last thought which had been in her mind before she fell asleep, namely the growth of the lichen-colored vegetation on the face and eyes and the throat of Mrs. Canning. At that thought the strangling terror of real nightmare began. She knew that she was being transformed into this gray stuff, and she was absolutely unable to move. Soon the gray would spread up her arms and over her feet, and when they came in from skating they would find nothing but a huge misshapen cushion of lichen-colored velvet, and that would be she. The horror grew more acute, and then by a violent effort she shook herself free of the clutches of this very evil dream, and she awoke. For a minute or two she lay there, unconscious, conscious only of the tremendous relief at finding herself awake. She felt again with her fingers the pleasant touch of the velvet, and drew them backwards and forwards, assuring herself that she was not, as her dream had suggested, melting into the grayness and softness. But she was still, in spite of the violence of her awaking, very sleepy, and lay there still. Lay there till, looking down, she was aware that she could not see her hands at all. It was very nearly dark. At that moment a sudden flicker of flame came from the dying fire, and a flare of burning gas from the peat flooded the room. The portrait of Handsome Dick looked evilly down on her, and her hands were visible again. And then a panic worse than the panic of her dreams seized her. Daylight had altogether faded, and she knew that she was alone in the terrible and dark gallery. The panic was of the nature of nightmare, for she felt unable to move for terror, but it was worse than nightmare because she knew she was awake. And then the full cause of this frozen fear dawned on her. She knew with the certainty of absolute conviction that she was about to see the twin babies. She felt a sudden moisture break out on her face, and within her mouth her tongue and throat suddenly went dry, and she felt her tongue grate along the inner surface of her teeth. All power of movement had slipped from her limbs, leaving them dead and inert, and she stared with wide eyes into the darkness. The spurt of flame from the peat had burned itself out again, and darkness encompassed her. Then on the opposite wall of her, facing the windows, there grew a faint light of dusky crimson. For a moment she thought it but heralded the approach of the awful vision. Then hope revived in her heart, and she remembered that thick clouds had overcast the sky before she went to sleep, and guessed this light came from the sun, not yet quite sunk and set. This sudden revival of hope gave her the necessary stimulus, and she sprang off the sofa where she lay. She looked out of the window and saw the dull gloom on the horizon. But before she could take a step forward, it was obscured again. A tiny sparkle of light came from the hearth, which did not more than illuminate the tiles of the fireplace, and snow falling heavily tapped at the window panes. There was neither light nor sound, except these. But the courage that had come to her, giving her the power of movement, had not quite deserted her, and she began feeling her way down the gallery, and then she found that she was lost. She stumbled against a chair, and recovering herself, stumbled against another. Then a table barred her way, and, turning swiftly aside, she found herself up against the back of the sofa. Once more she turned and saw the dim gleam of the firelight on the side opposite to that on which she expected it. In her blind gropings, she must have reversed her direction. But which way was she to go now? She seemed blocked in by furniture, and all the time insistent and imminent was the fact that the two innocent, terrible ghosts were about to appear to her. Then she began to pray, "Lighten our darkness, O Lord." And she said to herself, but she could not remember how the prayer continued, and she had sore need of it. There was something about the perils of the night. All this time she felt about her with groping, fluttering hands. The fire glimmer, which should have been on her left, was on her right again. Therefore she must turn herself round again. "Lighten our darkness," she whispered, and then aloud she repeated, "Lighten our darkness." She stumbled up against a screen, and could not remember the existence of any such screen. Hastily she felt beside it with blind hands, and touched something soft and velvety. Was it the sofa on which she had lain? If so, where was the head of it? It had a head and a back and feet. It was like a person, all covered with grey lichen. Then she lost her head completely. All that remained to her was to pray. She was lost in this awful place, where no one came in the dark except the babies that cried. As she heard her voice rising from whisper to speech and speech to scream, she shrieked out the holy words. She yelled them as if blaspheming as she groped among tables and chairs and the pleasant things of ordinary life which had become so terrible. Then came a sudden and awful answer to her screamed prayer. Once more a pocket of inflammable gas in the peat on the hearth was reached by the smoldering embers, and the room started into light. She saw the evil eyes of Handsome Dick. She saw the little ghostly snowflakes falling thickly outside, and she saw where she was, just opposite the door through which the terrible twins made their entrance. Then the flame went out again, and left her in blackness once more. But then she had gained something, for she had her geography now. The center of the room was bare of furniture, and one swift dart would take her to the door of the landing above the main staircase and into safety. In that gleam she had been able to see the handle of the door, bright brassed, luminous like a star. She would go straight forward. It was but a matter of a few seconds now. She took a long breath, partly of relief, partly to satisfy the demands of her galloping heart, but the breath was only half taken when she was stricken once more into the immobility of nightmare. There came a little whisper. It was no more than that, from the door opposite which she stood, and through which the twin babies entered. It was not quite dark outside, for she could see that the door was opening, and there stood in the doorway the two little white figures, side by side. They came toward her slowly, shufflingly. She could not see face or form at all distinctly, but the two little white figures were advancing. She knew them to be the ghosts of terror, innocent of the awful doom that they were bound to bring, even as she was innocent. With the inconceivable rapidity of thought, she made up her mind what to do. She had not hurt them or laughed at them, and they were but babies when the wicked and bloody deed had sent them to their burning death. Surely the spirits of these children would not be inaccessible to the cry of one who was of the same blood as they, who had committed no fault that merited the doom they brought. If she had entreated them, they might have mercy. They might forbear to bring the curse upon her. They might allow her to pass out of the place without blight, without the sentence of death, or the shadow of things worse than death upon her. It was but for the space of a moment that she hesitated. Then she sank down to her knees and stretched out her hands toward them. "Oh, my dears," she said, "I only fell asleep. I have done no more wrong than that." She paused a moment, and her tender girl's heart thought no more of herself, but only of them, those little innocent spirits on whom so awful a doom was laid, that they should bring death where other children bring laughter, and doom for delight. But all those who had seen them before had dreaded and feared them, or had mocked at them. Then, as the enlightenment of pity dawned on her, her fear fell from her like the wrinkled sheath that holds the sweet folded buds of spring. "Dears, I am so sorry for you," she said. "It is not your fault that you must bring me what you must bring, but I am not afraid any longer. I am only sorry for you. God bless you, you poor darlings." She raised her head and looked at them. Though it was so dark, she could now see their faces, though all was dim and wavering, like the light of pale flames shaken by a draught. But the faces were not miserable or fierce. They smiled at her with shy little baby smiles, and as she looked, they grew faint, fading slowly away like wreaths of vapor in frosty air. Madge did not at once move when they had vanished, for instead of fear there was wrapped round her a wonderful sense of peace, so happy and serene that she would not willingly stir, as so perhaps to disturb it. But before long she got up, and feeling her way, but without any sense of nightmare pressing her on, or frenzy of fear to spur her, she went out of the long gallery to find Blanche just coming up the stairs, whistling and swinging her skates. "How's the leg, dear?" she asked. "You're not limping any more." Till that moment, Madge had not thought of it. "I think it must be all right," she said. "I had forgotten it anyhow. Blanche, dear, you won't be frightened for me, will you? But I have seen the twins." For a moment, Blanche's face whitened with terror. "What?" she said in a whisper. "Yes, I saw them just now, but they were kind. They smiled at me, and I was so sorry for them. And somehow I am sure I have nothing to fear." It seems that Madge was right, for nothing untoward has come to her. Something, her attitude to them, we must suppose, her pity, her sympathy, touched and dissolved and annihilated the curse. Indeed, I was at Church Peveril only last week, arriving there after dark. Just as I passed the gallery door, Blanche came out. "Ah, there you are," she said. "I've just been seeing the twins. They looked too sweet and stopped nearly 10 minutes. Let us have tea at once." And with that, we will call our reading to a close for the night. Thank you all so much for joining me for this very special first Halloween reading edition. I hope to be doing this again next year. For any of those of you who are going to be out trick-or-treating tomorrow, please keep yourselves safe and keep an eye out for others. You can never be too careful in the world these days, so just take care of yourself and keep an eye out for those around you. And I hope you all make good on your candy gathering tomorrow, as I'm sure I will be handing out copious amounts of candy to sugared up children who probably don't need it. But then again, what's Halloween without candy? So, with that, I bid you all good night, and I will see you again on Monday, and we will be resuming our reading of Falcon Dance. We'll be resuming that next week. Same time, same place.